So today what I want to do is make some additional comments on the Ukrainian situation. You can pretty much go back and watch the last 3 videos I did on the subject and get a good idea of my positions on what's happening there and the possibilities of what could happen. Now, a lot of the comments that were left at Canadian Prepper's channel on the comment I made, and then comments left on my own videos, there's a couple things I'd like to talk about. One of them is the underlying conflicts in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. If you go back and you think about it, from ancient history to today, and us concentrating on World War I to present, the problem we have in Eastern Europe is the same problem we have in Africa, in South America, and in some parts of North America. And that is, colonial powers and conquerors and empire builders do not respect tribal boundaries. And if you think in terms of ethnic groups are consistent of one or more tribes. So when we look at how the United Nations and the Western powers and the Eastern powers, as their empires break up, the new boundaries were not established based on ethnic borders. This creates massive problems, and it also encourages genocides. Because what happens is these conquering powers move populations into areas that didn't originate there. So that causes tension. And these great empires suppress all these ethnic tensions while they're in control. But as they lose control or disintegrate or get overrun by other empires, then new boundaries are established, and it's not based on ethnicity. So you can see this in Africa with the boundaries there and the countries created. You can see it in the United States. So when you look at the border between the United States and Canada and the United States and Mexico, these borders do not recognize that certain tribes exist on both sides of these boundaries. So when you have conflicts in Mexico, you'll have these tribes join together and fight in either Mexico or the United States on behalf of each other because they're related. Same thing in Canada. Years ago, there was a mini civil war in Canada where a burial ground, which was considered sacred, was going to be used for a golf course in Canada. Members of the tribe in the United States went to assist the members of the tribe in Canada and took weapons with them and supplied weapons. And there was actually firefights with the RCMP. Now, when we apply this kind of thought to the situation in Ukraine, it goes back to the argument when the Tsar controlled the area. You had the Tsar and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in conflict. Today's boundaries are really based on the Soviet Union, the atrocities they committed, the lingering feelings, and then you graft onto that World War II with the conflict between Nazi Germany, Italy, and Russia. The Scandinavian countries, some of those are not NATO members, but they're allied with NATO. Then you have other Scandinavian countries such as Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which were prior territories of the Tsar and overtaken after they gained their freedom by the Soviet Union and oppressed. These are NATO members. Then you have Kaliningrad, which is a residual holdout area that the Russians are keeping from the old Soviet times. The same situation occurred in Ukraine. The agreement was just like the agreement the U.S. has with Cuba. The Russian government was going to keep the naval base there regardless. The U.S. has a naval base in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, which we keep regardless of what the communist Cuban regime thinks. Situation is the same there. So whether the Russians have to resupply this port by sea or by land, that's all part of the negotiation. And they were supposed to have land access. Now, All of the questions I get about having Nazis here and Nazis there, unfortunately, after World War II, the Nazis fled all over the world. So there's actually residual populations of Nazis in almost every country in the world. Now, the question that comes to mind is, it is true that the Waffen SS had the foreign legions based on the different countries in Eastern Europe and Europe proper. So a lot of forces allied with the Nazis and fought on their behalf against the communists. The reason for this was the communists in the Soviet Union were so oppressive and murderous that people would fight against them with any enemy that was convenient, continue the conflict. And in Ukraine in particular, the Soviet Union had no way to fund its 5-year plans and industrialize. So what they did is surrounded the Ukraine, took all the food, sold all that grain on the international market. All of the banks knew they were starving and killing these people. They financed it. People bought it anyway, even though they knew it was a genocide. This money from the foreign exchange for the starvation of the Ukrainian population was used to industrialize the Soviet Union in their 5-year plan. This is why Russians are hated in Ukraine. Now, this is not going to go away. They fought against Russians with some of the Nazis, some of the population did. There was actual resistance, Ukrainian resistance, going on up until the 1950s against Soviet Union, even after World War II. So that is the ethnic situation in the area. Nothing's going to change that. The current situation today, grafted on top of that, is the economics of the situation. So Ukraine has massive reserves of petroleum. This would give Europe and Nato a European source other than Russia. And all of the arguments that it's not economic and that it's military based on response time and encroachment of NATO is not factual in a military sense. It may be in a political and an emotional sense. And I'll explain this based on nuclear response. So the United States and Russia share a border on the Bering Strait in Alaska. So nuclear weapons in Siberia and nuclear weapons in Alaska, there's less than 5 minutes of warning. The US, Russia, China, and other countries have nuclear submarines. Launch on warning is less than 5 minutes. If they're on station off the east and west coast of the United States, we have less than 5 minutes from launch. Hypersonic weapons, no warning. They just come down out of slant orbit. You have no chance to shoot at them. They just hit. Then you have space-based weapon systems that are energy and kinetic. No warning on that. They would engage, they'd hit the ground before you had a chance to respond. So the fact that a warning time based on positioning missiles in Ukraine is an issue is just nonsense. Because if you look at it factually, engagement time is less than 5 minutes, down to 0 minutes depending on the weapon system. And that doesn't include forward deployment. Now, forward deployment is clandestine deployment of nuclear weapons in the area operations of the enemy. So there's 0 warning there, and both sides do that. So let's think about this. You see that Belarus is making statements about Latvia and Lithuania. So a Russian strike could be through Latvia, Lithuania, using Belarus as a proxy. That way they expand the Kaliningrad corridor and they split NATO in half. That's a possibility. Other possibility is they conduct operations in the United States and Canada on the west coast to interrupt oil. And see, that would be a tit for tat, where if we're interrupting their oil stream an oil market, they could interrupt ours. And both sides could do that clandestinely. All-out war is not the only option. There are many options in this situation. There could be anything from no action, a partial invasion, a total invasion, a theater war, or world war. Or it could all be clandestine operations and negotiation. So please comment, rate, subscribe. We'll see you on the next video.